I'm Tom Johnson, Thomas Johnson Antique Furniture Restoration in Gorham, Maine. Over the years, I've been very fortunate to have a lot of viewers ask questions about specific processes involved in furniture restoration. Today, we're putting up a compilation video with a lot of information that might help you with a successful furniture restoration of your own. From glues to clamps, stains, and glazes, here's a short course in the techniques and tools of the trade. If you like my videos, please subscribe and share, and feel free to repost on other platforms like Facebook and Reddit. Thanks. Enjoy the show. I'm Tom Johnson, Thomas Johnson Antique Furniture Restoration in Gorham, Maine. Most often asked question is, what kind of glue do I use? Basically, I use 3 glues for most everything. There are some exceptions. The first being spray adhesive. And that's good to have around the shop. It's good for making patterns, sometimes for putting down material on something. I also use a fast-acting type of super glue that can wick into joints, which is really good on pieces of furniture that are loose but won't come apart, and you feel you're going to damage them if you do take it apart. So you can use that once in a while. Also, it's good to have around the shop some 5-minute epoxy, and that's good for doing quick repairs. Typically I won't repair a piece of furniture, a permanent repair with this, but it's good to have around the shop if something breaks, like a chip or something, and you just need to get it back as quickly as possible. The glues I most frequently use are, first of all, hide glue, which you buy in flakes, mix with water. You need to keep it warm, although they do make regular hide glue, liquid hide glue in a bottle. I use hide glue primarily on period antiques. It's fun to use, I like using it, but more importantly, it's compatible with the antique furniture because it's more closely related to the glue that they used at that time. And then secondly, for most all gluing applications, regular yellow carpenter's glue is the best glue that you can use. And so I'll use this for gluing together most any other type of piece of furniture, or anything that needs to be glued together. The primary thing you have to remember about these 2 glues is that they will only work when you have good wood-to-wood contact. You must have wood-to-wood contact for these to work properly. And when you have it, they're the best. There are times where you cannot get wood-to-wood contact. Say an antique piece of furniture where the joint has rotted away, or has just been destroyed by so many repairs, it's in tatters, and you cannot get good wood-to-wood contact. Then I'll use a good marine-grade epoxy. At times, it's much better to use epoxy to bring something back together than to start recreating an entire section of a piece of antique furniture. So that's good for when you need it. And I also can tint that epoxy with regular dry aniline colors. So in conclusion, just remember, always try to have good contact between the pieces that you're gluing together. And then you can use either hide glue or yellow glue. And when you cannot get the pieces together, or some exceptional situations, use a good epoxy. There you go. That looks pretty good. I'm Tom Johnson, Thomas Johnson Antique Furniture Restoration in Gorham, Maine. One of the most commented on and frequently asked questions is all the different types of clamps we use here. As you know, doing repair work, we get in a lot of really tough clamping situations. A lot of pieces, when they're new, are assembled and then shaped. Now we've got to glue them back together, and it can be very difficult. One of the most commonly kind of clamps that we use are these fast action clamps. They can be used for a lot of different things and all different kinds of situations that we find ourselves in here. Also, we call them deep engagement clamps because there's this distance. This is short, just a couple of inches, but a lot of times you need to get around one object to clamp another object. And then you get into situations where you want more depth. This is a heavier duty fast action clamp, maybe 3 inches. This one gets up to 4 inches. And then of course we have a few of these monsters. This is a 9-inch fast action clamp. The other type of most commonly used clamps is spring clamps. They're good for clamping, around the edges, veneer things, small objects. They're easily operated with one hand, so you can hold the object, clamp it. And spring clamps are great for so many different things. Obviously, you have a short distance here. They cannot reach in far, although they come in different sizes. Some clamps like this can be quite powerful. This is a nice type of spring clamp. This has a screw here that adjusts the tension on the spring. So it's the only spring clamp I have that you can adjust the tension, because sometimes a clamp like this is too powerful if you're gluing together something that's delicate. And so the other most common type of clamp is pipe clamp, and I think a lot of people are familiar with pipe clamps. And they're used primarily because of the length involved. So we use them a lot gluing chairs together, or anytime you're gluing boards together to make a tabletop or a leaf. Obviously there can't be any obstructions in the way because they only have, a 1-inch depth here. If you're gluing together something that has obstructions, that's when you would go more with a deep engagement clamp like this. The big advantage of pipe clamps is that they're relatively inexpensive, and you can get all different length pipes, and you can use the same head and tailstock on different length pipes. This is a slightly different type of head and tailstock, but you can see the length of the pipe. And then they also make a smaller size like this. Now when you get into a long pipe clamp, they have a big disadvantage in that these pipes, believe it or not, become flexible and they will bend under pressure. And that's why they're really substitutes for a bar clamp. A bar clamp obviously has like a steel beam, is a much stronger clamp. They're also much more expensive. So I have a few long bar clamps, but mostly we use pipe clamps. In the same sort of category of clamps are these clamps, they have a bar here as opposed to a pipe, but it's very small, it's weak, but it's in the right direction here. And these are one-handed quick clamps. You can clamp it like that. But the reason I have 2 of these, then the main thing I use them for, is this headstock is reversible. It comes off of here, you stick it on the other end, and now you have a spreader clamp. And frequently we're trying to get things apart. You've seen me do it in many videos, and sometimes you really need to spread something, and this type of clamp makes an excellent spreader clamp. So fast action, spring, pipe, and bar clamps are the most frequently used clamps. But we have lots of other clamps for different specialty situations. This is, a C clamp. I think everybody's familiar with C clamps, appropriately named. Most of them are shorter ones like this. You have a very short distance here. This one, obviously, has a nice 6-inch distance. You can really reach into something. And of course, you're limited by this space here. This is a specialty type of C clamp. This is for clamping things to edges of tabletops. These screws clamp down to the tabletop, and then this will push, say, a block for veneer on an edge of a table. Another type of clamp I like using a lot and don't use very often are hand screws, also very familiar to a lot of people. They're easily adjusted in size to make it smaller, make it bigger. And they have an advantage. They do much the same thing as a clamp like this, but they do have an advantage in that the 2 jaws do not have to run parallel to each other. So you can get at weird angles of things. And these also come in a lot of different sizes. This is a large one. This is the smaller one. Talking about clamps, I'm frequently referring to the reach of the clamp, which is really critical and an important dimension for using, that you need to know in any clamp. And one clamp that I have here, this is a welding clamp, and it works just like vice grip pliers do. You can adjust the tension, but this has an 18-inch reach, and you can reach, like, say for instance, over a tabletop and glue down a veneer bubble right in the middle of the tabletop. So these really come in handy. And of course, another type of clamp that people are very familiar with is web clamps. And we have two different kinds. This kind is very commonly sold in hardware stores and used for all types of different uses. But in the furniture trade, it really comes in handy. It has a ratcheting mechanism here, so you go around your object, feed it through here, and ratchet it tight. Web clamps have limited use. They don't have a lot of power. They're better for holding something together. They won't bring a round object necessarily together as tight as you want. It really depends on the design. And we're usually working with odd shapes and designs. And of course, this is a big web clamp. And this we would use for big sofa frames, Victorian parlor chairs. And it's not a ratcheting mechanism, it's a screw type mechanism. So you go around your object, you pull the strap tight, and then you provide the tension. This clamp can be really strong and will really hold something big together when you need it to. Another type of clamp isn't a clamp at all. Masking tape. You've seen a lot of my videos. You can tape something together and it will really hold. And we use this mostly for, say, veneer repairs on table edges. You can hold down a piece of veneer, pull this tape tight, and it really holds it tight. And something I've used very infrequently, but you can use too, is clear wrap tape. This also, if you can hold an object together and then get this wrap tape around it really tightly, it will also hold very well anything. So this could come in handy once in a while for some really oddball shape that you're trying to clamp together. Another technique is the rub fit. Sometimes when putting, say, glue blocks in different places on a case, you can't clamp it. It's not very practical to clamp, or it's 90 degrees. So you can put glue on one object, apply glue to the other object, let them dry for a few minutes, rub them together, and when they stop moving like that, when you can't move it anymore, it's tight, it's together. It doesn't require a clamp. We've been talking about using clamps to clamp up glued objects together, but clamps are used a lot to hold objects, say, to your bench while you're working on them. You'll see me use a lot of these fast action clamps to clamp a board down to the bench. Spring clamps can hold boards in place when you need them, router jigs and stuff. But the most commonly used clamp for that type of work is your bench vise. You can't really do much without a bench vise. It can hold an object for you, so it gives you a third hand. So I think I've covered all the different types of clamps. Obviously, I have a lot of clamps. I used to have a much larger shop with 3 or 4 employees, and believe it or not, a lot of days we would have used all these clamps. I'm a smaller shop now. I still like having a big variety of clamps. They come in handy, and they look pretty good. I'm Tom Johnson, Thomas Johnson, Antique Furniture Restoration in Gorham, Maine. This is a video, one of a series of videos I'm doing to answer frequently asked questions. And today's video is about stain and how I use them in my restoration work. I don't recommend staining old furniture. Typically, antique furniture comes with its own color, which we work hard trying to preserve. But obviously, in doing repair work, you're frequently in a situation where you need to stain something to match the existing color and finish. So basically, I use 2 kinds of stains: pigment stains and dye stains. Pigment stains consist of pigment, actual pieces, of color, and a carrier and a binder. The kind most familiar to my viewers and everyone really are the oil stains you get at the hardware store. So you have your pigment and it's suspended in a solution of a carrier, which typically is a solvent like mineral spirits, and a binder like linseed oil. And so the carrier spreads this across your board. The pigment gets trapped in the grain and in the scratches and anything else. And then as the solvent carrier evaporates, the binder remains and helps it to stick to the wood. So the effect that the oil stain has on the wood greatly depends on the type of wood. This is a piece of pine I'm going to try it on. And how well the wood is sanded. In other words, oil stain, the pigments are larger molecules that depend upon the scratches, the grain, and any other defects in the wood to grab hold. So we have wood sanded to 100, sanded to 150, and sanded to 220. And we're going to see what the different effects are from one stain. In theory, when I apply this stain, the 100 will be darker, and the 150 less so, and the 220 lesser, because of the heavy scratch pattern of the 100 should pick up more of the pigment. And likewise, the other ones with much finer scratch patterns won't pick up as much. Pine does not take stain very well, does not take oil stain very well. We'll see what happens. Yeah, so I think that you can see the 100 is a lot darker, 150 medium, and then the 220 is even lighter. Same piece of wood, so it's all because of the scratch pattern with the sandpaper. Okay, now I'm going to try the same thing on my oak board. Oak is not nearly as soft as the pine. And this is white oak. Let's see how it works on this. Boy, it's interesting how on the oak sample there's very little difference, I mean, maybe no difference, which really brings up a couple of points. Number one, how drastically different types of wood are with the same stain, and then again, how they were sanded. The pine being softwood was much more dependent on the scratches for the stain. The oak has big open grain, and the pigmented stain stayed in there, and they all look more or less the same. There's not that much difference. This really shows how the theory doesn't always match the reality. In fact, oftentimes when you apply the stain, it won't match exactly what you're trying to get. Here's a project where I used the oil stain in an attempt to even out the color of some mismatched boards. And now I'll start experimenting with stain on the bottom here. I'm going to start experimenting with some oil stains because they'll be the easiest to deal with, you know, if I have any bleed through onto the unstained surfaces. I've got a stain here I like a lot, brown mahogany. This is a fast drying stain. Really, that looks really good. This brown mahogany stain looks great. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this middle section of my sample side here, let it dry, and put some finish on it. See what it looks like. Okay, I'm letting that set for a minute or two, and then I'm going to form the rag into a pad like this. Just kind of pat it off. It doesn't seem to be affecting my the part that I've sealed off much. And I'll dip the corner of my rag in a little paint thinner and go along the outside of my line here. Okay, I've let the stain dry for a couple of hours. I'm going to put a little finish on it, see what it looks like. It's not bad, it's a little light, which is good. I can always make it a little darker if I have to. I think I'm going to go ahead and put a little more finish just in this area, let it dry, and then figure out what my next step might be if I need to make it darker. Well, it's really not bad at all. It's a good color. It could almost be a little redder and a little darker. I got to think about that for a little while it's drying. Now, even while my sample area where I put the clear finish is drying, I think I'm going to experiment a little with the stain. I'm going to take the same stain, which is an oil stain, that I used on my sample area. Put a little in the cup, and then I'll add a little bit of dark red mahogany dye stain. See if they'll mix together and change it a little bit. I think that in theory the dye stain shouldn't mix that well with the oil, but I'll give it a try. Let's see what happens. It doesn't look that different. Well, maybe I'll add some more. Okay, I added a lot more of the dye stain. Let's see what happens. Let this sit for a minute. Now, I don't think it looks that much different. It might though. You know, even though I thought at first it doesn't look that different, but I could be wrong. I think I'm going to do this larger area with this new stain. Let that dry, and then put some clear finish on it. Okay, this second area is dried for about 45 minutes. That's the minimum amount of time for these stains, but I'm anxious to see what the color looks like. I think it looks really good. I think it looks better than the first stain. You saw in that clip where the oil stain wasn't giving me the exact right color, so I added dye stain to alter it a little bit. And that's quite fitting because really in my work I use mostly dye stains. So let's talk about dye stains. You can get dye stains in a powdered form and mix them yourself. I prefer to buy them already mixed. They're mixed in a solvent such as acetone or alcohol. These are NGR stains. That means non-grain raising. A lot of dye stains were traditionally mixed in water, and that just caused a lot of problems. You had to pre-wet the wood, raise the grain, sand it off, then stain it. It's much more complicated to use. We prefer these stains. In a dye stain, the solvent ionizes the colorant. So when it's applied to the wood, at a molecular level, it electrically bonds with the wood fibers. And that's one reason it can be very tough, if not impossible sometimes, to remove that stain from the wood if you make a mistake. So with a pigmented stain, the pigment's lying on the surface, and that implies a certain amount of opacity. With a dye stain, you've penetrated the wood. All you see back is the wood grain itself and the chatoyance, which is very important if you're using figured woods. So maple is a good example to demonstrate dye stain on. It's the kind of wood that doesn't really take oil stains very well at all. It's just too hard. And it also is very uneven with the oil stain. With a dye stain, it can be done evenly. This is a perfect brown stain. I've thinned it out 2 to 1 with thinner. Okay, so that's stained out a nice light brown. Now one of the advantages of dye stain, a big advantage, is I can apply more now of the same stain to make it darker. So I could keep going with that and make it as dark as I wanted to. And in fact, maple is one of those woods that if you did want to stain maple to look like mahogany or walnut, you have to use dye stains. So now I'm going to try it out on this nice piece of mahogany I have here. This has also been sanded to 100, 150, and 220. Let's just see if it makes any difference. Now I'll add a little alcohol to the rag just to help even it out a little bit. So unlike with the pigment stains, the level of sanding doesn't make nearly as much difference, if any at all, with the dye stains. So here's a clip of a 20th century reproduction bed where you'll see I use dye stains to blend back the repaired areas to the original color. Dye stains really come in handy when you are doing repair work to a factory piece like this one. These posts on these beds are made of maple. They were stained to look like mahogany, and they most certainly use dye stains in the process. So here where we've done some repairs, I've sanded areas here all the way to the bare wood, here sanded to finish somewhere it was marked up. So now I'll stain these with dark red mahogany dye stain. Okay, even though this bed is super dark, I'm going to mix the stain 50-50 with alcohol. You can always put on more and make it darker. So this is a great place of the bed to start because it doesn't show very much, so I'm going to experiment a little bit. So what I'll do is carefully brush on the stain. I have a rag handy to wipe it off if I need to. Well, you can't really wipe it all off, but... Okay, this is looking good. It's not as dark as this area over here, but that's fine. I can make it a little darker. I'm going to let that dry for a while. I'm going to do the inside here and then move my way up. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to this area, which we've sanded that area like down to the bare wood. This is has a mixture of finish and not, but I'll go over and see if I can blend it in. Okay, so that area still may be a little light, which is great. I can brush more on. But now for this area, I'm going to put the stain on my rag and kind of use a patting motion to blend all that in. And now for this top area, which was all scuffed up, and we just went over it really aggressively, but just with a gray Scotch-Brite pad. I'll just pad this out. So as you can see with the dye stain, you can brush it on and leave it on, so you can sort of get your color carefully, just leave it. Like I see this area here needs a little more color. When I think I've got this post pretty close, I'll let the stain dry, and then I'll seal this with shellac. And if anything, I hope it's a little lighter, because if it's slightly lighter, I'll tone it with a brown mahogany aerosol toner and bring it in exactly where I want it. So you saw there how well the dye stains worked on blending in a partially sanded area on the bedpost. Let's talk about how pigment stains and dye stains are used together. You saw in the clip on the small tabletop how I added dye stain directly to the pigment stain. But more commonly what you would do is stain the wood first with a dye stain to get your background color and then go over it with an oil stain. Here's a clip where I do just that on a contemporary chair. Alright, I've sanded it really well to 220. And I mean, I've sanded it really well as I can. This is a hard wood, it's like beech, something like that. You need to make sure it's really, really smooth so that the stain is as even as possible. And I'm going to stain this first with a dye stain, light red mahogany. Comparing it to my piece of the chair here, I think it's going to be okay. As long as it's a bit lighter than this, I'll be good. The dye stain is dried, and I'm going to put some mahogany oil-based stain over that. Try a little corner down here to see what it looks like. That's good. It's pretty close. It maybe will need a little bit of red toner to bring it into that, but I like what I'm seeing. So you see how well that worked on a contemporary chair, but I also use that technique sometimes on antique furniture. Here's a clip where I made new mahogany feet for a federal chest of drawers. Okay, so now I'm ready to stain it. I'm going to stain it with some Walnut Dye Stain. But with the dye stain, I can let this set for just a few minutes and then come back and put more on. Now the next step is I'm going to stain it with some dark walnut oil stain. Now this side looks a little dark to me, so maybe I'll get some paint thinner and just wipe it off a little bit. So now you've seen how I use dye stains and pigment stains to do most of the color work. But sometimes they don't quite yet look pretty good. You need to use toners and glazing, and I'll be discussing that in an upcoming video. I'm Tom Johnson, Thomas Johnson, Antique Furniture Restoration in Gorham, Maine. This is a video in a continuing series where we try to answer frequently asked questions. It's a companion to the video I made called Staining Wood, where I showed the different types of stains I use to stain bare wood. In antique restoration, color matching is the key. And in fact, when you look at an antique, most of the time the wood was not stained at all. The color is the natural color, but been affected by age and numerous environmental factors. So when you're repairing an antique and trying to match that color, staining the bare wood would rarely achieve the desired effect by itself. That brings us to today's video, where I'll discuss the techniques I use to achieve the desired effect. The word glazing typically means using a glaze coat, and a glaze coat is mixed with different oil colors. But I'm going to call glazing anything that we do over a sealed surface and between coats to affect and change the color. So over the sealed surface, I may use glaze. I may use regular oil stains as a glaze. I may use dye stains over the sealed surface, and quite often we use toners. Frequently people ask, why do I seal the wood and then use these stains for coloration? And you have to think about how the wood of the piece of furniture achieved its present color. It did it from age, oxidation, which is, I guess, is age, other factors, but it wasn't stained. And if you apply stain to the wood, it brings out the grain and does different things to it that it just will never match. So sealing off the pores prevents that stain from, bringing out the grain more than desired. And it also allows you, using these other techniques, a lot more flexibility and ability to reverse what you've done if it's not correct. So in this real life example, you'll see where I take a walnut carving, and although I do use stain on the bare wood in this case, I seal it and then do what anyone would recognize as conventional glazing, where I use actually asphaltum mixed in a glaze coat to achieve the desired effect. So asphaltum is exactly what it sounds like. It's some kind of tar, and I will mix it into a clear glaze coat. I've already done that. And I'll put it on, try to recreate the distressing I see here. So I've mixed a little of the asphaltum in some glaze coat here. The glaze coat is just a medium. It's thick. The kind I buy is extra thick, and it's made just for this purpose, adding oil colors and things like that. And in this case, we added the asphaltum, and now I'm going to apply it to my little piece here. I will put it all over the entire piece, wipe it all the way off, and then I'll go back and try to mimic what I see in the original, leaving bits here and there. So that was a good example of conventional glazing. This next clip shows me using dye stain over a surface sealed with 2 coats of tung oil varnish. This is a good example of how you can use dye stains during the refinishing process. This is a nice cherry chest of drawers, but the top is veneered. And on the end, you can see the end grain of the solid core. I'm not staining the cherry, it's going to be left natural. I put on 2 coats, 2 thin coats of tung oil varnish, seal everything off. Now I'm going to sand the end grain and tape off the cherry. So now I'm going to use a little bit of medium brown walnut dye stain. It may seem funny to use walnut, but I know that this has a lot of orange in it. And it's not exactly this color, but I think it'll get me where I need to be. And I have a rag at the ready. Now I can make it a little darker if I like, or even it out a little bit by putting some stain directly on my rag here and patting it along. If I felt I had a little bit too much on, I can take a clean rag, a little bit of alcohol, pat some of the stain off. I actually kind of like this color. I don't know, it might be too light. Better too light than too dark. I'll put another coat on this whole thing, and if it's too light, I can always do this again. If it needs a little bit more in the corner or a little bit more at the end, I can take my brush, add a little color. If it's a little bit streaky from my rag marks, that's okay. It kind of makes it help it look like wood grain, even though technically the wood grain is not going in that direction. I'm going to let this dry just a little while, and then I'm going to sand the rest of the piece of furniture and put a coat on everything and see how it looks. Okay, I've got this all sanded, ready for a coat. I can preview my staining job here with a little bit of paint thinner. I think that looks good. It's a little browner than the cherry, but when you're trying to match something or get it to blend in like this, you definitely want it to be less red than the surrounding area. That way it doesn't stand out. So this looks good. I'm going to go ahead and brush a coat on. So that showed one way to deal with end grain, which is a good example though of how, with end grain, if you stained the bare wood, it would just instantly be too dark. So you really need to seal it off and then go over it with a glaze or dye stain that I used or anything that suits the situation. So in this clip, I have a highly figured tabletop. I know it needs color. I don't want to stain the bare wood, so I added stain to my sealer coat of tung oil varnish. And when that didn't quite do the trick, in a subsequent coat, I actually diluted it a little bit, but I still had stain in the finish and brushed that on. So that was, that's a toning effect or shading effect to get it to the color I want. But layering color like this also greatly increases the depth of the figure. Okay, this top's all sanded now with 220. Now, I noticed when this top came in, besides all the obvious water damage, that it was really bleached out. It must have been in a really sunny location. The top is substantially lighter than the base. And I'm going to put a little paint thinner on here just to see what the color is and compare it to the base. The top is really light, and I can really see a huge difference here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to experiment a little bit. I have some stain here. This is pigmented stain from a local manufacturer. It's just brown stain. It's just called brown. Here's my tung oil finish, and I'm going to add a little stain to the finish. So maybe on the first coat, we'll be tinting a little bit. Now bear in mind, my goal is not to match the base. And in fact, in any piece of antique furniture, especially tabletops, the top should always be lighter than the base. But I want to take it a little bit more in that direction. It was a little bit too washed out. I'm going to try a little bit more. Okay, I've let it soak in for a few minutes. And just wipe it off. Alright, let that dry overnight. Alright, that first coat is dried overnight. Doesn't need any sanding or anything, it pretty well soaked in. Now time for the second coat, and I think I'll use a coat with some more of that stain in it. This is what I have left of the tung oil with that brown stain in it. And I'm just going to add more tung oil, not any more stain. I like the color I was seeing. When brushing a coat with stain in it, you've got to put on a really even coat. It can't have streaks that you wouldn't see with the clear finish. I'm anxious to see how this color looks with the base. I think it looks really good. It's the same color as the base, but a little lighter. It's just what I wanted. Alright, now just let this dry overnight. Okay, so this is dried. It feels like it needs sanding. You can't sand a coat that has stain in it. Probably would make that coat uneven or your stain uneven. But luckily with tung oil, you don't have to sand between coats. And I'm just going to blow this off and then apply a coat of clear tung oil. The next clip is a continuation of a clip we used in the staining video, and it shows a contemporary chair where I used dye stain, then an oil stain, which is a good way to achieve kind of this factory look, then sealed it. The color was close, but I needed to tone it with aerosol toners to bring it in where I wanted it. I've allowed the shellac dry overnight, and so now I know I've got to do some toning. I can see from this sample I've been using that I'm definitely a little bit browner. What I do is I have a piece of black construction paper here that I've drilled 2 holes in, and that's what I use to check color with. I placed these on the 2 things so you can really see what you need to do. And actually, I knew starting out that this sample was lighter, and that was fine. My color's good, but it's way browner. It needs to be redder. But what really matters is not this piece, but the rest of this piece. So I'm going to cut the paper back here and compare what I've got to the crest rail. And so right away I can see how much browner this crest rail is and the rest of this back compared to my sample. I knew that going into it, but I wanted to use a sample that was lighter just so I didn't go overboard. I think maybe I just need a little mahogany toner on here. So I'll seal this back up, sand my shellac, and try toning this a little bit and see how it looks. I'm really going to sand lightly with just some 500 gold. I don't want to pull up any color that I already have. You can see color on the sandpaper, so that's why I've got to be really careful sanding. I've got a brown mahogany toner. Now let's see what it looks like. It's looking okay, I think. I may have to let this dry to see for sure. And although I'm a little unsure of the color, maybe a little browner, I still like what I see, and so I'm going to go ahead and tone everything with the brown mahogany. Then I'll decide what and if other kind of toner I need to use. I've let the toner dry, and so I'm looking at my color. It's still different. It's still a little lighter, but it's actually really close. One of the difficulties is that the factory finish here is a little more opaque looking than my finish, and it's very, very flat. That's going to make a difference too. I pulled back the paper on the slat, and the slats are even lighter than the crest rail, so I'm thinking that I'm okay. I'm not going to mess around with this color anymore. And I'm going to bring one of the other chairs from the set over here. Take a look at it too. Yeah, I'm going to call that a day. I mean, the colors are kind of all over the place, and I'm right there within the spec, so it's good. Now, all I need to do is pay a little bit more attention to my new piece of wood right here. I'm going to take that off and color it a little bit. Okay, I've sprayed about, I don't know, maybe 8 coats on all this, both sides with my flat aerosol, and it looks good. It's nice and low luster, and it looks like a factory finish. So now I'm going to remove all my tape and stand back and see how it looks. Yeah, I think the color looks pretty good. It looks really good with the crest rail. These are lighter, but that's okay. They're all in the same ballpark. I'll know better when I hold this up and compare it to some of the other chairs in this set. Comparing this to one of the other chairs, I think it looks really good. So I think I can now proceed gluing the chair up. As you saw in that clip, toners are invaluable to really fine-tuning your color. In the next clip, you'll see where I've repaired veneer on the edge of a table. And as I approach the final color, I've got colors all over the place, both from my new work and old work. And you'll see how I use a toner as the last step. It just kind of brings everything together. Okay, I finished sanding with 220. And yesterday I glued up a piece of the same veneer that I used for the edge, and I've sanded it to 220, and I'm going to try some stains out on it. The first stain I'm going to try is some light golden oak. The color is good. It's a little light, but I like light. I'd rather have light than too dark. I think I may try this on the table itself, and if it's light, that's okay. I'll seal it with shellac and then add a little more color to it. Okay, I've let the stain dry for a couple minutes, and now I'll wipe it off. I'll kind of pat it off. Remember, the stain was light, so I don't want to wipe it off too much. Now this is fast drying stain. I'll set the timer and let it dry for an hour. So the stain is dried, and so now I'll apply a coat of shellac. And first I'll put a coat on the sample. Well, that looks pretty good. I was hoping to have a little bit more of a yellowing effect. Doesn't seem to have much effect, but I'll put my first coat of shellac on, and then I'll see what I can do about the color. It's not changing the color too much, the shellac is not, but my new wood is lighter than the old wood, and that's what's important. I'll go back after the shellac dries and then figure out exactly what I'm going to do to blend it in. The initial coat of shellac has dried, so now I've got to add a little color. You can see my new patch it's a good color, but the wood surrounding it is a little bit darker, a little bit grainy. And that's good. So I'm going to try first to add a little bit of raw umber color to some shellac and apply that just to the patches. First, I'm going to go over this with a 500 paper, just lightly. It may be a little too dark. I'm not sure. I can always add some more shellac, but I'm going to try it anyway. I can always, wipe it off. Yeah, it is a little dark, but by then wiping it slightly, it gives me a little bit of that grainy effect and blends in pretty well. In fact, when I stood back a little bit, I had a hard time even spotting where this was. So I think I'm just going to keep going like this and wipe it off as needed. Actually, I seem to have just the right amount on the brush now, and it goes on pretty well without even the need to wipe. As I work my way around the whole perimeter here, there's lots of areas, even where I didn't work, the old veneer, where there's color variations. There's a lot of color variation in this edge, and so I'm able to even go and touch up some of these light spots too, and take the curse off them a little bit. A lot of different areas. The touch-ups look good. It's funny, when I'm up close like that, I can really see a lot of variation. When you stand back and look at it, it looks a lot better, thank goodness. So what I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to take some light golden oak aerosol toner, and I'm actually going to go over this entire edge, and that will, I think that will like really pull it all together. Yeah, that was definitely a good move. In fact, some of these areas I may hit a second time. I'll let this dry a bit, and then I'll check it again and hit it wherever I think it might be necessary. But it's really looking good now. Okay, I've let the golden oak dry for about a half an hour. And now I'm going to spray it again, but with clear gloss lacquer. So there you saw how I used a yellow toner just on that edge to kind of bring everything together. In this next clip, I have new wood. I've made new pieces for an 18th century antique. I stained the pieces with a dye stain, seal it with the aerosol shellac, glaze it with the umber glaze, fix that glaze with the aerosol shellac, and then use a green toner to kill the red a little bit. Okay, I've let the dye stain dry for about 45 minutes, and now I'll seal them with shellac, and then once they're sealed I'll decide if I need to do some more color work. Yesterday evening I sprayed these with another coat of shellac, let it dry overnight. You'll see that my samples here, my new pieces rather, are much redder even though I stained with Van Dyke brown stain. That's to be expected. All wood, especially mahogany, loses its redness as it ages. So anyway, I'm going to cut back this shellac with a Scotch-Brite pad, and then I'm going to glaze it with a raw umber glaze. So after using the abrasive pad, I just went over it real lightly with a little 500 to really cut the fibers and make it really smooth. You're always worried about cutting through the color, you know, down to the raw wood. But I managed to do that and get it really smooth. So the glaze coat, glaze is just some medium, some oil-based medium, and then it's got oil colors in it. And in this case, raw umber, which has no red. So the nice thing about glazing, it's just very versatile. It does add a little color, and in this case adds color and I hope decreases the red. It also darkens up the corners and shows little defects and stuff to help make this look older. And you can, you can control it because it's on top of the finish. You can wipe it off almost completely if you like, just leaving it in the corners. Or in this case, wiping it lightly, very lightly, to get off some of the excess, and then taking a dry brush and just sort of evening it out. But I'm leaving a fair amount of glaze on here. It looks good. It helps it look like the old piece that I'm sampling to. And then when I'm done, I'll let these dry for an hour or two, and I'll spray on another coat of shellac, fix this glaze. You can see already that the color's a lot better. So I gave the moldings another good coat of shellac. They're still a little too reddish. They're not bad, but they're redder. And what I have here is a green toner. It's actually green. And I'm going to mist some on these moldings, see if I can kill the red a little bit. That definitely, just that little misting took the red away. I'll let that dry for a few minutes. And then I'm going to give these a couple coats of satin lacquer. So I hope you've seen in this video and my previous staining video everything that I use in my color work. And there's a lot of different stains, a lot of different techniques. There's no one set way to do things. We're constantly bobbing and weaving. Every piece of furniture is different. It's a very good idea to get yourself a color wheel. Sometimes it's really obvious if a piece is too red, well, you tone it with green. But you may not know if that piece is too yellow, that you tone it with purple. Color wheel comes in handy. Good luck. Everything you need is right at the hardware store. I hope your project comes out looking pretty good.